Well, it went long.
Be glad running season's over with. I know.
Start skipping things.
Or cold this morning on that tractor.
Need to get you an umbrella.
Uh, I'm,
Get you one of them big tractors that got the heat, all that type stuff.
well,
Cab on it.
well, I dreamed about that.
Yeah.
As far as it went.
Hurt the arm and leg with big ones. Mm-hmm. Like around about 100 plus.
Yeah, Kevin been trying to get me one the last 3 or 4 years. He hadn't got there yet.
Okay. Let's the screen up where it needs to be. I'm sure y'all talked about y'all go over Solomon marrying Pharaoh's daughter. Yeah. Uh, we'll go ahead and start with the laws on judgment on the harlots or prostitutes. So when I talk about Solomon a lot of times, I will talk about that Solomon was the wise, foolish man. So wisdom, he asked for wisdom, but what was his wisdom? What kind of wisdom did he ask for?
It wasn't for riches and
No, he didn't ask for riches and stuff, although God did give him that because, yeah. But but his wisdom wasn't, you know, Paul talks a lot about wisdom. He talks about the wisdom of the world. There's a lot of wise people in the world. Uh, Whether you like him or not, Elon Musk is one of the smartest guys around. And, a lot of times with that uh, intelligence comes with a certain level of wisdom. And he has a track record. Every business he's ever touched has been, you forget about some, one of the ones is one of his very first businesses was PayPal. And he sold it for quite a bit and then he moved on. But Elon Musk has a master's degree in economics from the Wharton School of Business in Pennsylvania, and he has a master's degree in, I think it's mechanical engineering, or it might be electrical engineering from also University of Penn. Went to get his doctorate at Stanford, and then left because he figured he could do a lot more on his own instead of wasting his time in academia. And of course, Tesla, the rock. Huh? How old is he? He's in his early 50s now. Yeah, early 50s. And so, um, anyway, but very wise man, but he does things, and his way he lives is very foolish in many ways. And so, Paul talks about the wisdom of the world, and but the wisdom of the cross. And so a lot of people don't see wisdom in doing what God wants you to do. And I won't say Solomon was quite to that level. In fact, before we get done with Solomon, we'll talk about Ecclesiastes and go into that because we see that he does, as he ages, he gets a little wiser and he understands the foolishness of his ways. But a lot of Solomon's life, yes, was wise. But what was the wisdom in? If we have to, we can go back and read it. But what kind of wisdom did he ask for?
Leadership.
Leadership. What kind of leadership? For what?
Being a good king.
Being a king, governance. He asked for wisdom and governance. And once again, you've got someone like like Donald Trump that is very good. He wrote the book Art of the Deal, and he still talks about how good of a negotiator he is. And you see this in a lot of things. A lot of this stuff about him saying, I'm going to put a tariff on this or tariff on that. And all of a sudden, these countries that wouldn't have anything to do, all of a sudden, they're like, oh, okay, what do you want? I read where, the Mexican government's even sending soldiers now to work with our soldiers to battle the cartels and stuff they try to run drugs in. Well, that would have never happened without the threat of doing the tariffs. And so we see wisdom in that. But, there's things that, especially in some of his past times, that Trump has done things that, like I say, is not really becoming of a Christian for sure. But the way the world looks at it, that's okay. Solomon wanted wisdom to govern. Now, what do you think might have been some of the reasons he asked for wisdom to govern?
The nation of Israel had grown.
It was large. It had grown large at this time, yes.
The population was like sand on the seashore. It couldn't be counted.
Yeah.
But a lot of Solomon's, you could almost read what we read last week, his humility, because he asked God, stated to God that basically, I don't feel qualified because I'm too young. Or,
yeah,
for that bigger responsibility to govern so many people. And,
yeah, and Solomon probably wasn't much younger, if any, than David was when David became into prominence. But yeah, he was still young, and he considered himself young, inexperienced. That David was a man of war, and his experiences as a youth were war related, and so David understood how to run the military, but David's shortcomings. What would you classify as David's shortcomings, some of his shortcomings? Because David was revered as a king. And so Solomon, part of this, I think, part of his wanting to be a wise king, a governor of his land, had to do with the fact that David was so highly thought of from the time he died that, it's hard to replace someone like that. So I think he understood that he needed that help to make sure that he would win the trust of the people. But what about David? David wasn't a perfect man. David's known as a man after God's own heart, but David did make mistakes. And a lot of times it was in the governance of his people as a king. Now, David learned on the fly, as I say, so he made a lot of mistakes. Solomon grew up in a, son of a king and learned in that environment. But, David's mistakes usually cost lives because it cost civil wars, it cost other things. And so Solomon did not want that. He wanted to be the best king he could. And well, I'm gonna back up. Let's back up and look at 1 Kings. Well, and notice the difference in Solomon as he's young. In 1 Kings 3, verse 3 says, Solomon loved the Lord, walking in the statutes of David his father, only he sacrificed and made offerings at the high places. Now, wait a second here. Well, we're going to see, but he wasn't as firmly committed, I don't think, as David. But anyway, he asked for the wisdom. In verse 10, it says, it pleased the Lord that Solomon asked this, and God said to him, because you have asked this, and have not asked for yourself long life or riches or life of your enemies, but have asked for yourself understanding to discern what is right. Behold, I now do according to your word. Behold, I give you a wise and discerning mind, so that none like you has been before you, and none like you shall rise after you. I give you also what you have not asked, both riches and honor, so that no other king shall compare with you all your days. Um, Many have speculated Solomon may have been the richest man who ever lived. His riches was amazing. The amount of wealth that's put in the temple is just astonishing. Uh, and but he puts a condition on, God does. And if you walk in my ways, keeping my statutes and my commandments as your father David walked, then I will lengthen your days. So we're going to say he kind of falls short on that. And, and so, but that was a condition. Now, obviously, a wise man in regards to God, that wouldn't have been an issue. But Solomon, a lot of these things led to his own problems. So his wealth, his ability to uh, deal with political issues and earn political favor led to a lot of wives from these various kings, even the king of Pharaoh, which actually was a no-no. We'll get into that a little later, but uh, you know, God had said don't intermarry, and Solomon anyway, he really misses the boat on that. As a result, he builds these high places for a lot of them for idol worshippers. Everything that God said would happen happens because Solomon was weak on those matters. But Solomon was indeed a wise governance. It led to a lot of money. Now, I think especially when we're young, I think most of us would be like, "Oh, I want the money. Show me the money," as they say. I want the nicest car, nicest house. Give me as much money as possible. But I've spent some time with some people that have some money, and there is a burden that comes with being wealthy. And I'm not talking about having enough money to, that's all of us, I think, would love to just not have to worry about we can afford our bills, things like that. I'm talking about wealthy. Um, I had a good friend that was wealthy, and you know, especially in a smaller town, is it easy to hide if you have a lot of money? Everybody knows you have a lot of money. I mean, in fact, all of us probably know who the people with real money in town are, uh, and throughout their lives, they get people that come to them hand out, I need this, can you help me out? We went to school together, and on you get people that want this, and it is a burden of itself to know when you should give. Everybody wants to be generous, but when you don't need to. Lived in a town in Texas, Sealy, Texas, for a while, and their most famous citizen was Eric Dickerson. At that time, he was a big time football player. Of course, he was part of the reason why SMU got the death penalty way back when. But anyway, he, by the way, the biggest thing he did when he went from the college to the pros, he traded in his brand new Corvette for a brand new Porsche. So it was a little bit higher level pay, but anyway. So, he had a thing when he's playing for the Rams. He said, if you come out to Los Angeles, said I'll give you free tickets. And I want to tell you, there were people that slammed him, saying, "How dare he do that? We've known him his whole life. Said he's making me pay for my own place." And I'm like, "Yeah, but he's giving you free tickets if you go out there." And they're like, "Well, he should pay for a hotel. He should." So he's got a lot of money now, and it is a thing you're going to be ridiculed. And so the fact that Solomon did so well probably was also a burden, and probably why he uh, uh, had troubles, because I think what makes us, and Solomon really had no adversity except for his own doing his whole life. Uh, had a lot of wealth. He had all these wives. Had The greatest land, as far as size, was during his time, and no adversity at all. No wars, no problems with his family like David had. But what makes you who you are? What really keeps you disciplined? What keeps you, you know, really self-aware and always trying to do what's right? Is it not the adversity sometimes we face? And so, in one sense, not having that adversity may not have been the best thing in the world for you. You get kids that have a born with a golden spoon. They never have troubles. Well, at to a point, at some point, you're going to have troubles in your life, so you need to learn how to deal with them. What's your thoughts on Solomon?
I'm glad I wasn't like him.
Well, a lot of people say I'd like to be like that, but yet look what. And the thing is, by the time Solomon becomes an old man, he realizes not only the error of his ways, but the consequences of what he's done. The kingdom gets divided because of Solomon and because of the things he did. And at some point, there's nothing you can't undo it. So as bad as David's mistakes were, the kingdom itself always stayed preserved, whereas Solomon, the mistakes he made actually led to not only the division of the kingdom, it led to further people going away from God. And as someone that wants to be a believer in God, that is probably the worst thing you could ever do and find out about yourself, that you caused division, you caused harm, you caused people to go away from, worshiping God. Doesn't matter how much wealth you had. What was your legacy? And as a result, although from a standpoint of greatness, wealth, prosperity, peace, Solomon's reign was the best ever in all of Israel. However, we've talked about this. If you were to ask anyone, and this has been from that time on, even to this day, who the best king in Israel was, they're all going to say David, as far as an earthly king. Okay, well let's go on. So one of the probably the most famous things to illustrate Solomon's wealth had to do with these two prostitutes. 1 Kings 3:16 through 28, if you want to look in your Bible. It just demonstrates his wisdom. And this is something that Solomon shows here. It says, then two prostitutes came to the king and stood before him. The one woman said, "Oh, my lord, this woman and I live in the same house, and I gave birth to a child while she was in the house. Then on the third day after I gave birth, this woman also gave birth, and we were alone. There was no one else with us in this house, only we two were in the house. And this woman's son died in the night because she lay on him. And she arose at midnight and took my son from beside me while your servant slept, and laid him at her breast, and laid her dead son at my breast. When I arose in the morning to nurse my child, behold, he was dead. But when I looked at him closely in the morning, behold, he was not the child that I had born. But the other woman said, No, the living child is mine, and the dead child is yours, and the living child is mine." Thus they spoke before the king. Now, think about it. First of all, a mother, I think, knows when it's their child. So, despite this woman tried to do this ruse, replacing her dead child with the live child, a mother would know, even though it hadn't been that long after, maybe just a day or a few hours, whatever. I think a mother would know. But so what do you do? How would you decide this? Didn't have DNA, didn't have, even a blood test would probably have told which child was which. Didn't have any of that technology that we would have today. So how do you go about and solve that? It gets down to knowing people. I think a lot of your people that make wise decision in governance, they're people that they understand the general makeup of how people are. And that's in essence what Solomon does here. It's wise, but it's really not that hard to think about if you think about way people react. And the king said in verse 24, "Bring me a sword." So a sword was brought before the king, and the king said, "Divide the living child in two, and give half to the one and half to the other." Well, wait a second, Solomon, you went off your rocker. But he knows what he's doing. But you can imagine the absurdity of it. We'll just cut it in half, give half to each mother. And yet, how are the mothers going to react? Now, I think I would be appalled no matter what, but you wouldn't try to take someone's child either if you were of a high moral standing. And so then the woman whose son was alive said to the king, because her heart yearned for her son, "O my lord, give her the living child, and by no means put him to death." So why would she say this? If it's her child, why would she give up on the child?
She didn't. She took it alive.
Right, right. So you've got to keep, above all things, you want the child to live. A living child, if you truly love it, is a lot better off than a dead child. And so she quickly changed her tune on that, and I'm sure it was very noticeable. Let's see. Then the king, wait a second. "Oh, my lord, give her the living child." But the other said, "He shall be neither mine nor yours divided." So she don't have to admit guilt. She don't have to admit anything. Just go and divide them, and that way we're both the same. That's really evil, but there's
Mine will die. Yours needs to die.
needs to die. Yes, and there's a lot of people that have that type of attitude. If I'm not going to get anything, you don't deserve anything either. And that is about as anti God, I think, as you can get, because we all are blessed in our own ways. We all have hardships in our own ways, and we should never wish ill on anyone. And so this woman, was heartless about this. Then the king answered and said, "Give the living child to the first woman, and by no means put him to death. She is his mother." And all Israel heard of the judgment that the king had rendered, and they stood in awe of the king, because they perceived that the wisdom of God was in him to do justice. Now, I want you to understand, so how easy is it for someone to have an audience with the president to reconcile anything? If either you or I say we have a dispute, say we had a property dispute, and we say, well, we're going to take it to the president. I'm going to talk to Trump. So what's the odds of you actually getting to talk to Trump about it? It wouldn't happen. So why was the king of all Israel hearing a case of two lowly prostitutes? And the answer is why Solomon was highly thought of. So it didn't matter that these people were of not importance. The importance was the child itself. And so Solomon rendered a decision that showed his wisdom, but also his compassion of humanity by even listening to this case. He wasn't just king over the nobles, wasn't just king over the wealthy or whoever. He was king over all people. And so, so that also, I think, shows a lot of his wisdom. He could just let the lower judges taking care of this, but Solomon actually heard this case and rendered a very wise decision, and I'm sure it became very well known. Now, most of Solomon's younger life, and I think, a lot of things you can talk about Solomon and his problems, and some of the problems of Solomon come from the standpoint, kind of like David. When did David get in trouble? David was man of war. He was war all the time, and then he finally got old enough. They said, David, you don't really need to fight anymore. You just stay home. Why did that cause problems for David?
Got bored.
Got bored. That's when he started looking out his window and saw Bathsheba, and it led to all kinds of problems. So Solomon, in his younger days, when he's first king, what was his primary mission and goal in life?
Build the temple.
Build the temple. And what a massive undertaking that was. But what about when you get done with that? Solomon wasn't at war. Solomon, all he had to do, I guess he could count all his gold.
Sit down.
Sit around, count gold. Oh, look there. Wow, I got some more. But it leads to a lot of problems when you don't have purpose in what you do. So when Solomon's building the temple, he really sticks to his focus, sticks to what was important. But as soon as it's built, that's when it gets into, he talks about in the book of Ecclesiastes all these things he got into because it's like, but then it was all vanity. It didn't mean anything. So whether you're still working age, whether you're retired, whatever you are, you need to have a purpose in life. Marvin's chicken farmer now. He's got big purpose now. So, but it's important to have a purpose in your life. A lot of people that retire, they don't have any focus, and they're not very happy when they get retired. Church Haley and I went to not long after we married, and we kind of hung out with a group that a lot of them were retired. The guys were, and they had retired, and their wives were all still working. Most of them had married slightly younger wives, and so they were all retired and happy and content, and so we was there long enough that, basically the women, a few years later, they retired and the men went back to work then. So they had too much to do when the wives retired. So they decided to go back to work and have a little easier. But it's good to have something to do, have a purpose in life. You're never too old for that. Now, most people I know that have been retired, they tell you they're busier now they're retired than they were when they worked. It just the way it works. That's good though. That's good. We need to have a purpose in life. We need to have things that we're doing. And I think Solomon lost that. Once he completed this. But anyway, a bulk of the rest of this deals with things that Solomon did in preparation. Hiram, King of Tyre, and some of that, Cedars of Lebanon, all that type of stuff was used for the construction of the temple. If you want to, you can go through and read all that, but I think we'll just pass on that. It's just a catalog, but it does show the impressive wealth, how much was done. He even rebuilds the royal palace. By the way, when I say he spent a lot of time on it, he did spend a lot of time on it. Even some of the other things, the item 131 says the building of the royal palace, 13 years in building. How long did it take you to build your house? But anyway, and on it goes. And really, what gets important though is the building of the temple itself. Now, in 1 Kings 6:1, it says, in the 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt, in the 4th year of Solomon's reign over Israel in the Mount Aziz, which is the 2nd month, he began to build the house of the Lord. It's interesting. Why do you think there's a timetable on that? By the way, the thing that's so great about this verse is it dates just about everything. So when you see people that they date when certain things will happen, even in your Thompson chain, So if you look at it, let's see, 1 Kings 6:1, it will probably give a date. No, yeah, 967 BC. It's one of the firm dates we have. What's really unusual about it, there's some things in the Old Testament we have a firmer date than some of the things in the New Testament. But anyway, 480th year after the people of Israel came out of the land of Egypt. So what has taken place? Let's just kind of sum up some of these things. And so what all has taken place since they came out of the land of Egypt?
They received the law.
They received the law. That's right. They received the law, and that was the important thing. And they were instructed to build a tabernacle, tent meeting, and they had the Ark of the Covenant, all this, and that's how they would worship God. The structure of how the law is set up, how they were to the Aaronic sons of Aaron be the priest, all that was established in that. But their whole thing was when they came back was to go to the land of promise, but didn't happen right away, did it? What did they do for 40 years? Wandered in the wilderness. So then they were allowed to. So what time frame? The wandered in the wilderness 40 years, and then they get to go and start occupying the land. Moses dies. Who's the leader of the people at this point in time? Joshua. And so now they get to occupy the land. And so Joshua deals with that, and even that, they didn't quite do it exactly right. They didn't completely drive out people. They made some covenants, agreements with certain people, and that would lead to future problems.
They started murmuring.
They started murmuring, yes, and so then God would raise up the judges, and so we have all this history of the judges, and they'd fall away from God, they get taken kind of into bondage of some form, and then God raised a judge up, and they'd conquer everything. It went on and on. It's like I think 15 total judges. The last two judges are not in the book of Judges, but in the book of Samuel. So you have Eli, the next to last judge, who was also the high priest, and then you have Samuel, who was the last judge. And so what did the people grow tired of? They wanted to be like everyone else. And so what did they want?
Get rid of our prophets and have king.
Want a king. So Saul was the first king. And much like you talked about how Solomon was very humble when he started, so was Saul. Saul was a very humble sort. In fact, when they were trying to name him as the king, they had to first find him because he was, kind of bashful about it. So didn't even tell his own family that, hey, I've been anointed by Samuel, be king, all he told them was, hey, he told me where the donkeys were. So anyway, so you had Saul. Saul reigned for 40 years. And towards the end of Saul's reign, you got a guy, David. Saul had done wrong, and so God turned his back on him and anointed David as king, as a young teenager. David killed Goliath. David was a war hero, and yet Saul wanted him dead. So Saul tries to kill him for the next several years, and eventually Saul dies in battle. And David becomes king, not over all of Israel, but over just Judah. But eventually he becomes king over all of Israel. And how long did David reign? 40 years. Yeah, that's for the major kings over the united Israel, that's just always say 40. So now we're to Solomon. So now if you think about it too, 480 years, so 80 years of that, it's been Saul and David. And so then you had the judges, and you had 40 years of wandering wilderness. So all that time, it's a long time. Now, a lot of times I think sometimes in biblical history, we think, well, that's not that long, but that is actually a long time. How long has our country been a nation?
200. Well,
No, it's over 200. So let's see, I think we're hitting our 250th pretty soon. In fact, it'll happen during Trump's administration, the second one, 250 years. But once again, that's about half the time of that this take place. So a lot has happened. Is in other words, it's a long period of time. Why don't you think? Why do you think it took so long for them to decide to finally build a permanent house for God? So what some of the things that happened in that history, we talked about Eli, the next to last judge. He had two worthless sons, Hophni and Phinehas, and they, without God's approval, decided to take the Ark of the Covenant, lead them into battle, and it didn't go well. And so the Ark of the Covenant was taken under captive. Didn't go well for the Philistines either. Eventually it was returned, but not returned all the way to where it was supposed to be. So you even had a period of time where they didn't even worship the way they were supposed to. And so eventually David brought the Ark of the Covenant back to Jerusalem where he was king, where God has now put his name. And so now you finally have a time where they can actually build a temple. But it took that long for them to get their act together, you might say. They were worried about too many other things. And, in many ways, it kind of got almost in shambles. You even had a king that killed most of the priests at one point, that being Saul. And so, anyway, so you finally are getting to where you can build the temple. Why was David not allowed to build the temple? David's the one that first approached God about doing it, but why was David not allowed to build the temple?
Because people killed.
Yep, he was a man of war. That wasn't who God wanted to signify this. Was those wars not authorized by God?
They were necessary.
Yeah. So it wasn't that David had done wrong in the wars he'd done. It's just that that's what he was. He was a man of war. And that's not what God wanted. Now, why did Israel have so many wars?
They were commanded by God to drive out all the foreigners.
They were.
And some of them they did, but others they didn't.
They didn't. So it was a thorn in their side for the rest of the times. In many ways, still is. You go back to turn back to Judges chapter 2. And so what if they had drove out all the people they're supposed to drive out?
It would have been a pure nation.
Been pure nation. It would have been a place of peace. They never would have had these problems. But anyway, they didn't. It's kind of like, in one sense, it's kind of like, well, what would happen if Adam and Eve had never sinned? Well, they'd still be in the garden today. But we know that wasn't going to be the case. But they had their opportunities and they faltered. In Judges chapter 2, it says, Now the angel of the Lord went up from Gilgal to Bochum. And he said, I brought you up from Egypt, and I brought you into the land that I swore to give to your fathers. By the way, I like to kind of say something about this every time this entity is brought up. No other angel speaks like this. This angel here is speaking as God. I, God, brought you up. Well, it's the angel Jehovah. Well, yes, it's the deity. That's where I believe there is good reason to believe this is probably the pre-incarnate Jesus Christ that could speak for God, speak as God, that it was Jehovah. Anyway, I brought you the land, swore to give to your fathers. I said, I will never break my covenant with you. And you shall make no covenant with the inhabitants of this land. You shall break down their altars. But you have not obeyed my voice. What is this you have done? So now I say, I will not drive them out before you, but they shall become thorns in your sides, and their gods shall be a snare to you. Anyways.
That's what I get back there in chapter 3, where it says that the uh, Solomon worshipped in the high places.
Yes.
That was a practice that was introduced way back that
Yes.
time.
And it was a thorn.
And
Yes.
it was.
In fact, they called the place Bochum, which means a weepers or sadness. So they understood they had messed up. You know, the problem with Israel is as time goes on, they mourn their own behaviors less and less. Even in the New Testament, we see this. You know, when Peter points out when Jesus himself would point out their failures and how they'd always been go against God's ways, and yet fewer and fewer people would take heart to that. Today, in the land in which we live, at one time, more people was probably more. If you told them, well, this is sinful, this is wrong, and there'd be people be like, yeah, we've done wrong. Well, there's less and less people that feel they've done wrong anymore. And so that's ultimately what took place with Israel. So next week, what we'll do is we'll get into the temple, the dedication of the temple. We'll talk about that, and then we'll kind of go more into Solomon, his faltering, I guess the best way to say it. You see it in there when it said he allowed the worship in the high places, and you see it as he's marrying these foreign women. But we're going to see that after he has this lofty goal of building the temple, that things become to crumble for him. He too did not do a very good job with his own son. It leads to division. Anyway, Solomon, the wise, foolish man. So he was wise in governance, in leading his people, but not in anything else. So is he someone you want to be like? Well, I could see maybe if you were some type of leader, you'd want to be able to have the wisdom in some ways like him to lead that thing. But I would hope that we'd all agree that that's really not that important when it gets down to it. It's much more important to have that wisdom of the cross and go from there. So next week, we'll talk about the temple. Now, I knew a guy in Georgia. He was, of all things, his occupation was a contractor, but he built church buildings of all kinds. And he made some pretty good money, but he built big church buildings, and everything of different types, you might say. But so he was uniquely qualified for this. I wish I'd kept the copies he kept. He did a meticulous. This was in around, I guess, 2000, probably around year 2000. And he took all these quantities, these building materials, and he made a list of them, and best he could, he came up with a cost, like if he was a contractor and he was asked to bid on the project, and he itemized everything. He came up with his cost to have been able to reproduce that and to have it and to build the size of the building it is. And he had all the dimensions, like a contractor would, like he's getting ready to build it. He did that. And this was back in 2000, and the cost was around, I think it was $8 billion to build this temple. Now, you say, well, I've heard of things cost more than that, but this was 2000, so multiply it by many times since then. But the other thing is the temple itself was not that big. Our building, our church building, is probably bigger than the temple proper itself. So could you imagine building a church smaller than our building, and it cost $8 billion? What would you put into it to make it cost $8 billion? It had a lot of solid gold in it. Yes, it had a lot of jewels in it. It had a lot of these. So I've seen some antebellum homes in Tennessee, and so these columns. A lot of times they're talking about these columns. Now, you probably are thinking, well, the way they do that, they would piece several trees together and they would grind them and glue them together and do that. No, that's not how they did them. Even in the antebellum times, they would find a tree big enough for the column, and they would, uh, would make it round or whatever it was. But like those huge antebellum homes in Columbia, Tennessee, that are just amazing. And you go up there and you see them. It's a 30-foot tall column and everything. You're like, wow, that's pretty impressive. And then you hear the history of it. It came from a tree that was probably 60, 80 foot tall, and they made it into a column. It is a solid tree. That's how they used to do it. And so this temple was made by timbers like that. And then it was overlaid with gold, and it had all these, these precious jewels in all these places. And it had, it was just amazing. But $8 million worth, something smaller than our auditorium there. Or
Through the gym in London, England,
uh
of all of the kings and queens' crown jewels and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
It gives you an example of what you're talking about. That was pretty important to those people, apparently, to have that sort of thing.
It was. And so, anyway, we'll talk about how the glory of it. We'll talk about something that happened when the dedication happened, much like when the tabernacle was dedicated, how God's presence was there. And I want you to pay close attention. We'll also go to fast forward, even when the temple was redone under Zerubbabel. That experience is never said again. For one, what is missing in the later temples? The temple of Zerubbabel and the temple of Herod the Great. What was missing? What was put in the temple? Ark of the Covenant. Yeah. The Ark of the Covenant is not in Zerubbabel's temple, and it's not in Herod's temple. What happened to it, you think? You haven't watched Indiana Jones, have you? Anyway,
My favorite.
they're one of your favorites, yeah. But we don't know what happened to it. It got taken. It probably got destroyed. God probably allowed it to be destroyed. Um, it appears it may have been from historical documents. It may have been even taken and destroyed, or removed, even before Nebuchadnezzar leveled everything. But it was gone. And so God's presence never returns like it did in the time of Solomon. So that was when the temple was at its height. In fact, Ezekiel talks about when God's presence actually leaves the temple and never again. Now, temple was rebuilt, temple was reused, but it was never the same as it